Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. In an age where information is shared across the globe with one click, the way stories are told can shape public opinion and even policy. And nowhere is this clearer than in Gaza, where much of the Western media coverage has been accused of tilting heavily to one side, and that's Israel's. Even journalists inside major newsrooms are speaking out, exposing editorial bias and selective framing. Critics warn that this imbalance risks fueling a global crisis of trust in the media itself. Nili Kozad has more.
It is often said that in times of war, truth is the first casualty. In Gaza, where tens of thousands of lives have been lost, this is more evident than ever. Critics say major Western media outlets regularly show bias towards Israel by softening their language, avoiding accountability, and steering coverage to echo the Israeli narrative. This glaring double standard was exposed when Israel targeted and killed 4 Al Jazeera journalists, including 28-year-old Gazan reporter Anas al-Sharif, alleging he was affiliated with Hamas. Reuters reported the story based on Israel's claims, while other outlets also led with the Israeli perspective first, with rebuttals buried much deeper in their coverage. But not everyone accepted the claim. UN bodies and press freedom groups called the killing unjustifiable.
The accusation against Anas al-Sharif and a number of his colleagues is not new. We've seen it, we had already denounced it, we considered that the proof given was completely insufficient. The answers we got from the Israeli government were not at all satisfactory.
More than 200 journalists and media workers have been killed in Gaza since October 7, 2023. Israel also targets civilian infrastructure, bombing mosques, refugee camps, and hospitals, with the recent Nasser hospital attack killing at least 20 people, including aid workers. Analysis suggests that media giants like CNN, BBC, and the New York Times report these incidents in a passive and even vague tone. A recent report by the Center for Media Monitoring found that emotive language is used 11 times more to depict Israelis as victims than Palestinians. Meanwhile, terms like occupation, genocide, and massacre are often omitted entirely from Western reports. These terms are central to how Palestinians describe their lived reality. The result, a systematic imbalance in reporting. In times of war, the media must seek truth, not serve power. Because neutrality without balance and accountability is not neutrality, it's complicity. Nili Kozad, Straight Talk.
For more, joining me now from London is Tara Kangarlou, a journalist, author, and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. From Vienna is Harvey Dzodin, senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and from Ankara, Ragip Soylu. He's the Middle East Eye's Turkiye bureau chief. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining me. Obviously, a lot going on in Gaza, and as journalists, we're covering it closely. Sometimes we happen to be in the line of fire if we're covering it from Gaza. Tara, I want to begin with you. Is Gaza now the most dangerous place for journalists to be?
Thank you for having me on the program. And as I always say, the story should be covered and told by Palestinian journalists. And for me, it's a privilege to be part of the conversation. But of course, in this very sad situation that so many of our colleagues, Palestinian journalists, are facing in Gaza. And to answer your question, Gaza has for many months been the most dangerous place to be a journalist. And unfortunately, because international journalists are being banned to enter Gaza, Palestinian journalists remain the eyes and ears of the world to see the humanitarian crisis, the catastrophe that's unfolding in the Strip. And one by one, they are being killed. The latest numbers, according to RSF, tally over 220 journalists who have been killed in Gaza since the start of the war in October 2023. And again, the law is the law. International law is the law. I'm no expert in that, but what I do know, and my panelists and you and the entire world knows, that targeting and killing of civilians, medics, and journalists is a war crime. But we unfortunately continue to see that unfold in Gaza.
Harvey, what would the absence of journalists in Gaza mean for the conflict?
It would mean that people don't know what's going on there. I believe this is a deliberate policy of the Israeli government. And I have to say, as a former vice president of ABC television and as a Jew, I'm really nauseated by what's going on there. I think we need more coverage, not less. We need to know what the facts are on the ground. And I always recall what the philosopher Erasmus said. And he said, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And so all the kings have been killed, and very few voices are left to tell us the true story of what's going on there. And I think we all need to know. We worry about the conduct of the IDF and what's happening there.
As journalists, we often cover war zones, and Gaza is a war zone. Ragip, the dangers of the occupation of being in war zones, obviously very, very evident. You've had experience in war zones as well. But when we look at what's going on in Gaza, they always say, one is by chance, two is a coincidence, three is a trend. I think we could say maybe four is policy. What's happening there right now? Is Israel directly, specifically targeting journalists?
I mean, we have our own experience. As you know, Middle East Eye lost on its own two journalists, Mohammed Salama and Ahmed Abu Aziz. They were killed in the Nasser hospital attack 2 weeks ago. And we also published a couple of stories on basically digging on what happened, the events that led to that double tap attack by the Israeli army that basically killed our colleagues. And we just realized that there's a backstory, especially specifically about Mohammed Salama. He has been working on series of news stories that basically expose Israeli crimes, killing of civilians, hospital bombings, and specific killings related to the aid side, as you know, GHF, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, is basically running a very controversial aid distribution site where civilians are basically killed every day. And one of those sites, one of the sources of Mohammed Salama, was basically detained by the GHF security team and basically interrogated about Mohammed Salama, whether because Mohammed basically wrote a couple of stories to us anonymously to protect himself, and GHF basically was investigating who was writing these stories about GHF and the Israeli military operations in the Gaza Strip. So that gives you the idea that there's been an investigation by Israeli acolytes in Gaza Strip to basically to reveal the identity of a Middle East journalist. And coincidentally, in 10 days time frame, he's basically killed at the Nasser hospital. So it's not a coincidence. It is basically a targeted attack, as far as we understand. And it's very clear there's a deliberate a set of operations targeting the Palestinian journalists. We understand it how, because a couple of other journals working for Al Jazeera, they received calls from the Israeli intelligence teams. They were basically being told, shut up or else. So they were threatened before they were killed. And these people were killed because they had clout. They've been basically, reaching the millions of Muslims and an Arab audience all around the world through Al Jazeera and all other venues. And Israel doesn't like that. And we understand from the Israeli local media reporting as well, as there's been an expose that basically indicated that Israel has its own separate intelligence branch, which basically works on how to legitimize the killing of journalists and activists on Gaza Strip. So very clear that they don't want the world to know what's going on in Gaza, and that's why they're targeting journalists.
Tara, I also want to talk a little about the state of journalism in Israel, especially as a foreign correspondent there. When you look at what's happening inside Gaza, do you feel that the journalists that are operating inside of Israel, are they comfortable? Are they under pressure? Are they self-censoring? Or are they reporting what they feel?
That's an excellent question. I have to say, for transparency, I never reported in Israel from inside Israel. But speaking to folks and also Israeli friends and also Israeli journalists that I know, so many of them tell me that the narrative and the story and the coverage of the war in Gaza is so different from the reality on the ground, from what we're seeing on networks like TRT or Al Jazeera and other international outlets that are covering the humanitarian crisis on the ground. So it's interesting to note that the Israeli public is receiving a narrative that is in many ways contradictory to the reality on the ground. And that takes me to the point about narrative control and the impact of journalism and storytelling on policymaking. Because if you imagine for years and years and years, a story has only been told through one prism, one perspective, the public believes that perspective, that narrative. And that continues to be the case. Unfortunately, right now, again, the Israeli public does not get the full story, aside obviously from what they are being given by the dominant media and the narrative that exists in Israel. But of course, right now we live in a world of social media. And of course, so many Israelis are also against this war. I was actually speaking with a source in Israel over a year ago, and he told me, he said, this war will come to an end when the Israeli people are up in arms. They tell their government that we're angry and we don't want this bloodshed. We want our hostages back and we want an end to this, because what's going on is to the detriment of our society and, of course, the people of Gaza. And perhaps we are seeing a little bit of that protests among the Israeli public, but I would say not enough, because the government is certainly not changing its policy.
Mm-hmm. Social media is definitely playing an important role. Harvey, how important is that role?
It's much more important today than it was a few years ago, because more and more people are getting their news from social media. And so we have to pay attention to it. Also, major news sources like in America, whether it's CNN or ABC, where I used to work, or the other legacy networks, they engage not only in infotainment, not news, but they're now afraid of the consequences of crossing President Trump. And because of that, I think that they're adhering mostly to the Netanyahu line. I think it's very important for Americans, especially as well as Israelis, to get the true picture, because it's America that's really propping up the Israeli regime. And Americans are divided like Israelis are divided. But we need to know the picture so we can push back with our legislators and with our government against even President Trump, who seems to be very allied with Netanyahu, unfortunately.
Ragip, the global media landscape, especially in the English language, I mean, for years it was dominated by Western outlets, CNN, BBC, whatnot. But I mean, starting with Al Jazeera, we saw a trend, TRT World, then RT, CGTN, where you're at, Middle East Eye. How important has it been for the East to have their own English language broadcasts, especially in covering something like Gaza?
I think it's very important to have a broadcast, but also, YouTube, social media, especially nowadays, Substack, like, places like Dropsite is based on Substack. And they've been really effective to expose the issues that are surrounding Gaza and the region. Dropsite has been doing an excellent job, and they have a really small team of journalists who are based in abroad, in the US and also in the region as well. Middle East Eye, as you mentioned, we are reporting from the ground. We're really a small team of journalists, but through YouTube, especially, we can see that we are making a huge difference on social media, on Instagram, and also on our reporting on our website as well. To basically counter the narratives, you have to basically go back to the fact itself, and the fact is not basically given by these major news outlets. There's a lot of criticism about New York Times reporting in the headline. They don't want to use the words like ethnic cleansing. They don't want to use the words like genocide in the headline. And we made a decision at the Middle East Eye 2 weeks ago, and we just decided to basically name what Israel has been doing in Gaza as a genocide. Because if you wait for ICJ decision, which might come in like 2-3 years later, and if you wait others to basically come to that conclusion, you're basically aiding the narrative that Israel has been building. Like, we always use genocide within the quotation marks. We always behave like, we don't know what's going on really over there. We know. Everyone knows what's going on there. The International Genocide Scholars Association, local Israeli NGOs, Amnesty, everyone else, UN, everyone else called it as genocide. But, the mainstream media still wouldn't do it because they just wait for International Court of Justice to issue a judgment, which might come like in 2 years later, and the war would be already end, in Gaza. So that's why it's important to have these diverse views, different smaller outlets, to basically come out and do their own thing and report what's going on the ground, other than relying on mainstream media, which is really, susceptible to the Israeli pressure, as you could see on BBC. BBC had been basically, shaping its editorial line with the Israeli pressure over the 2 years. They withdrew documentaries, they, deleted their reports, etc. Even though there has been no wrongdoing on those reports, just semantics. Because of the semantics, they basically deleted their reports, which is like insane to see that BBC is, not broadcasting a documentary on the killing of the medical staff in Gaza, which people worked on for months, and it just got through the necessary, credibility check. That they did the job well. Even then, because of the Israeli pressure, they just didn't broadcast it.
I really like that statement. We all know what's going on, whether we see it or not. Tara, if we all know what's going on, why is it not being reflected on Western screens? What's stopping the Western media from reporting on exactly what they see on the ground and exactly what's happening?
To that point, I also want to restate the sentence that we all heard. You kill journalists where and when you are afraid of the truth. And we have seen around the world, by the way, journalists being killed and detained because the government of that state, of that country, is afraid of the truth. That is the case in so many places across the Middle East and elsewhere around the world. And that tells us something, that what's happening is contrary to the agenda and policy of that government and that regime. And that tells us everything, right? Based on my own experience being an Iranian woman, but an American journalist, I remember in the mainstream newsroom rooms that I worked for in the US, in Washington in particular, one of the networks was very much against me covering the Iran story because somehow they thought I have a bias. And that takes me to a point that I want to elaborate on, and that is humanizing the people of the region, of the places that we cover, oftentimes through stories of war and conflict. And the fact that we don't have authentic, real voices, real journalists from that region covering those stories is a problem that has contributed to dehumanizing those societies. And that has been the case for Iran for so many years. I spent my career trying to humanize this society and this country. And that has been the case with Palestinians and Gaza. And I think that's the issue. I think there's this exuberant hubris and arrogance among some Western journalists that, our narrative, our version of the story is somehow more truthful and more factual, where in reality, that version oftentimes lacks nuance, context, and really the isms that are required to understand the reality on the ground. And again, coming back to our colleagues, Palestinian journalists who are being killed in Gaza, they're the ones who actually know the story. They're not doing parachute journalism, and they're being killed.
Harvey, as someone who has experience as a executive at a major international channel, what level of pressure is there from foreign states or state apparatus to self-censor or to adhere to a certain narrative? How would you balance that? Also, the fear of domestic leadership wanting a certain narrative. How does that work? How do you balance that as an executive?
Well, I would say this is a case of then and now because I think things have changed significantly. I think 20 or 30 years ago, a network like ABC was much more balanced, much more fair. It took seriously its responsibility as a major source of news for the American public. But today, I think the model has changed. The model is more about making money, and making money means you don't piss off the powers that be. So it's why ABC and some other networks have caved in to President Trump and his frivolous lawsuits because the owners do not want to lose their licenses, basically, to print money. So I think we're in a very fraught time now. The only positive, I guess you could say, is that the major news networks are not the only game in town anymore. That there's a lot more sources of information online. But the problem with that is there's so many sources of information that we're drowning in it. And so how do we get a true picture of the actual narrative? I think we live in very difficult times. We had hoped that the internet would be a savior, but really it's turning out to be a whole new set of problems. It really is not a pretty picture at the moment.
Ragip, I want to ask you a hypothetical question. You walk into your newsroom, your editor-in-chief gives you a new assignment. You look at the paper, it says deployment to Gaza. Let me know what's happening there. How safe do you feel going to Gaza? Do you go there thinking, okay, it's a war, the general risks are, no, I'm going to be specifically targeted? Do you accept it or do you decide not to go?
I think I would consider most possibly that I will be targeted, but there are a lot of different dimensions of this. Like I'm a Turkish journalist, so killing a Turkish journalist could be more costly to Israeli government than killing a Palestinian journalist. But still, our publication was specifically targeted. We lost not only two of those journalists, we lost other freelancer reporters that had used to work for us in the past year or so. So Middle East Eye is specifically targeted in Gaza. So as a Middle East Eye correspondent deployed to Gaza, I would just definitely think that, I could be targeted and I would basically behave and follow set of protocols to prevent any kind of attack from happening. So it's very clear that Gaza is not safe at all right now. But if Israeli government makes a decision finally to allow international journalists to be on the ground in Gaza, and not only me, but we see other journalists all around the world being able to visit Gaza, that could prevent, the death of more journalists in the future.
Tara, Harvey touched on something when he started talking about the bottom line, and I guess we'll call it bottom line journalism maybe. What can be done to avoid that financial pressure put on journalism, journalists, this type of lobby pressure? What can journalists do?
I think Harvey might be able to elaborate on that better. But listen, we are in the business of truth telling, accuracy, fairness, and truth. And these are the words of my USC journalism professor many years ago. He was also a Jewish man, an American, an award-winning American documentary producer. And he embedded something in my mind. He said, Tara, never forget, facts matter, accuracy matter, truth and trust matter the most. And I think it's on all of us to remember these elements when we do our work, regardless of what network we work for. Another point that I wanted to mention was also the fact that so many of the journalists who, by the way, in Gaza are reporting right now, and those who have been killed had the opportunity to leave. And I know this story has been repeated a few times, but Mariam Daqqa had an opportunity to leave. Her son left about a year and a half ago to the UAE, but she chose to stay. So these are people who, again, coming back to your question, feel as if it's their responsibility to tell their story. Because, as I always said, if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell that story for you. And that story might then be one that you don't like, but more so one that's not factual.
I'd love to continue the discussion, but we're well over time. Tara, Harvey, Ragip, thanks for joining me. Thanks for sharing your views. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.